to start, can you share a little bit about where your dad's side of the family is from in Armenia?
Sure, yeah. My dad's side of the family came from the Harpert region of Armenia, which is Western Armenia at that time, in Turkey. But they specifically came from the village of Hore. So Hor is dirt. So all the people that lived in that village were farmers. So, we're known as the Horetsis, and there are many of those that came from that area that are in the Fresno area as farmers. And all of them ended up being farmers because that's what they knew and what their ancestors did.
Do you know what your father's family farmed?
Yeah, so they grew. My dad, his earliest memories, he was about 5 years old. They had he told us, like a 2-story house in what was somewhat rolling hills, and they grew wheat, basically, in that area.
Can you tell me more about what your grandparents and father's life were like in Armenia?
I don't know that much. I never met my grandfather, and my grandmother was fairly old. By the time I came of an age, I could have conversations with her. But I think it was a simple life. I think it was, one of farming and being in a family unit and just doing the farming that they did in that area.
Did your dad have any siblings?
He did, yes. And if I were to go a little more detail into the story, my grandfather came here, and I'm assuming through Ellis Island, but we haven't been able to locate his name in the registry. But we do know that he came to the East Coast, and we do know that we had cousins in Massachusetts. And apparently he spent a couple of years on the East Coast before he came here to Fresno. He had cousins here in the Fresno area. And my dad and my grandmother left Armenia sometime at the beginning of the Armenian massacre. And initially they did go to Syria. And then from there, they made their way to France and then ultimately to Mexico. And as you talk to a lot of Armenians about, where they came from, a lot of them came from Armenia to the East Coast, many through Ellis Island, and then on to California. My dad's side of the family came through Mexico. So they landed in Veracruz and then made their way to Mexico City. And we were able to look at a passport that he had to see all the locations they had stopped at, that ultimately made their way north in Mexico and ended up in Tijuana. And they actually lived in Tijuana for about 4 years.
Wow.
Before they got the proper papers to come into the United States. My grandfather was already here in the Fresno area and was doing some farming. And then eventually when the rest of the family got their papers, they were brought over. My dad was born in Armenia, but the rest of his siblings were not born until much later. So there was a fairly large gap, about 16 to 18 years between my dad and his siblings.
Wow.
And he had one brother and 2 sisters. And as I understand it, the family bought a 10-acre farm that they initially were growing vegetables on, things like onions and peppers and tomatoes. So my dad is what you would call, and grandfather were truck farmers. They were growing vegetables, putting them on a truck, and then taking them into the local wholesale markets to sell.
Wow.
And then eventually he ended up planting the 10 acres into vines. They grew grapes that they dried into raisins.
Mm.
And there's this history with Armenians growing grapes and specifically making them into raisins.
Mm.
Uh, very rich history with that, for
Wow.
sure.
Can you share more about that history? What do you know?
Yeah, well, this area was very well suited to grow things like cotton and tomatoes and wheat and fruits and vegetables. But they knew or planted grapes, I think primarily because there were so many people around them that were also planting grapes and drying them into raisins.
Mm.
So my earliest memories were growing around grapevines, and my dad had that farm. I'm not sure the year that he bought it, but I think it was somewhere in the late 1920s. Um, and I'm not sure exactly what year they planted the grapevines on them. But when they sold it in the late 1960s, it still had the grapevines on there. And
Wow.
from where I am living here to where his original farm was, it's probably about 6 or 7 miles as the crow would fly.
Hmm. So you mentioned your grandfather did leave Armenia a little earlier than your dad and
Yes.
grandmother. Do you know when he came?
Yeah. As best we know, he came somewhere around 1912, 1913,
Mm.
and was on the East Coast for a couple of years before he ended up coming into the Fresno area.
Do you know why he initially left?
Um, So 1912 was definitely before the massacre started, but there may have been some pressure that they were starting to feel. And certainly, as you know, there was in this area immigration like in the late 1800s and then the 1900s. So I think the ones that came before probably sent messages to family members about what was available here and the opportunities that are available in this area. So I don't know the exact reason, but I have to somewhat surmise it could have been a combination of
Mm.
things.
And do you have any stories about your dad and grandmother's lives in Tijuana?
I do, I certainly do. And if I had found the photos that I was looking for, I think to me it's incredibly interesting to see the diaspora and how Armenians were basically flung to every part of the world that you can imagine. So there, as I understand, there was a community of Armenians that were living in Mexico and specifically in Tijuana. And I have this one photo that probably shows, I don't know, somewhere around 200, 250 people, mostly women and children, very few men. And I think it's because most of the men were here in the United
Mm.
States. Um, and so that community learned to thrive in a different land and a different language. As a result of my dad having lived there, he knew Spanish fluently.
Wow.
So that was a real benefit for us being in farming, being able to talk with many of the laborers
Mm.
who only spoke Spanish. So here is my dad, brown hair. He actually had blue eyes. And you wouldn't think he would speak Spanish, but he spoke Spanish fluently. It was always incredible to watch him speak it because he spoke it so well.
Mm.
So that was a definite plus. Fast forward years later, this was about 1986 or so. One of the people that he grew up with was having his 50th wedding anniversary in Tijuana.
Mm.
So I drove both of my parents over there. And it was so interesting. Here we are in this community that's Armenian, and Mexican. And I'm either speaking broken Armenian to them or broken Spanish to them. So it was kind of a unique way to communicate with them.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and I know that to this day there are still some in Tijuana. In fact, there's a gentleman who contacted my cousin that is writing a book about the Tijuana Mexican or the Tijuana Armenians.
Mm,
So very, very interesting to see when that book does come out.
that's fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. But none of it, my dad's uh, siblings were born there. They weren't born until they came here. But actually, there's a little more detail to that. My grandfather was able to visit my grandmother in Mexico, and she became pregnant. And like a lot of immigrants, they wanted to have US citizenship. So we were able to look at their passports and see that they came into, it was either San Ysidro or Chula Vista
Mm.
to have the baby so that it would be an American citizen. And then after that, went back into Mexico.
Wow.
So very, very, a typical story that you would hear of immigrants that want, have their children be Americans.
Mm. You mentioned your dad spoke Spanish and also Armenian.
Yes,
Did he speak any other languages?
English,
Okay.
and that was it.
Uh-huh.
Those three.
That's great. I'm curious, do you also know about your family history on your mom's side?
Yeah, so that is also, and they're all very interesting stories. So my dad, being much older than his other siblings, um, my grandfather died at a relatively young age, about age 53. So his siblings were just teenagers. And so he took on the responsibility of being like a father, being a provider to them, and helped them through school, helped them through college. And I guess one day my dad wakes up and he's 44 years old. Um, some of his siblings are already married.
Mm.
He's not. And he says, it's time for me to get married. And so this was about 1957. And at that time, there were plenty of Armenians that he could have dated and married here in the Fresno area. But my dad wanted an old school woman, Armenian woman.
Mm.
So he left and he spent 6 months in the countries of Syria and Lebanon. He did have some distant cousins that he visited, but he spent that time basically going from family to family, meeting various eligible women um, and dating them. So over the course of this 6 month period, as I understand, he went on lots of different chaperone dates. And in my mom's case, he was invited to the house not to meet my mom, but to meet one of her other sisters.
Mm.
And my dad saw that my mom was in the kitchen doing all of the work. And he said, "Who's out in the kitchen? I want to meet her." And within a week of meeting her and dating, they got married.
Wow.
And within that week's time, they were already on a plane, honeymooning, and flying back to the United States. So here is my mother. That the only thing she knows about the United States is really through movies. So she knows about Hollywood. She knows about movies and glamour. And she knows that she's gotten married. She's coming to the US. She's coming to California. And that's about all that she probably knows.
Wow.
Because as my mom tells the story afterwards, had she known that she was coming to a dirty, dusty farming area, she might have reconsidered.
Mm.
She thought she was going to Hollywood. So my mom she comes over here and in pretty quick succession has my older sister, my older brother, and then me.
Mm.
And then 10 years later, she has my youngest sister. So my mom came here not knowing any English. She was in French schools in Aleppo, Syria, Haleb, as it's called. And so she knew French. She, of course, knew Armenian. She knew Arabic, and she knew a little bit of Turkish as well.
Mm.
When she gets here to the US, besides having babies and being a homemaker, she takes courses at the local college
Wow.
to learn English and to be able to take the test to be a citizen. And I think within about a year and a half of being here, she became a US citizen.
Wow, that's amazing.
I think she was pregnant with one of my siblings.
Mm. Did she ever tell you any stories about her life in Armenia or her other relatives?
Yeah, she grew up in a fairly large family. I think there was a total of 8 of them, 7 sisters and 1 brother. Her dad was a baker. I don't know that he owned the bakery. Um, she talked a lot about going to see movies, particularly American movies with subtitles,
Mm-hmm.
and just all the glamour and glitz that you would get from seeing an American movie at that time in the 50s.
Wow. And do you know when her family came to Syria?
I'm going to have to guess that they were part of the march of Armenians that went through the Syrian desert.
Mm.
And her mother and father, who weren't married at the time, were able to survive that march and then met each other when they were in Aleppo, Syria.
Mm. And are you aware if any of her siblings ever came to America?
Only to visit.
Okay.
The majority of them moved to Switzerland. And in fact, my brother and his wife and kids are just coming back from a vacation
Mm.
where they're visiting some of our cousins
Wow.
in Switzerland. So some were in Switzerland and the others remained in Syria.
Mm.
In fact, I think one of her last sisters just passed away in Syria within the last 5 years.
Mm.
It was just after COVID.
Wow.
And my mom really didn't want to go back to Syria, I think because of the relationship between the United States and Syria kind of being on bad relations. She didn't really want to have an issue
Mm.
with going back over there. The family's name was Garabedian, but apparently some immigration officer in Syria wrote his name in where their name should have been.
Mm.
So somehow the family name got changed to Susani. So all of them were known as Susani,
Wow.
not Garabedian.
That's
And
fascinating.
it's something that they ended up having to live with. But, you know, these are just stories. They're just indicators of a name. They're not, they don't identify who you are
Mm.
inside.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your mom and dad's experience in California. You mentioned that they were both learning English, but I was
Yeah.
wondering if there were other ways they were trying to assimilate or they were trying to reject assimilation.
I think as you will probably found out, a lot of Armenians assimilate very quickly. That's been one of our unique traits. Wherever we've gone in the world, we've just assimilated into that culture, even though we
Mm.
retain much of our own culture. Um, I know that when my mom came over, she did not speak English. I know that My dad didn't either, but he quickly learned. He was still of a young age. But I also know that when we were born in the 60s, that my dad and mom were speaking Armenian to one another because that's what she knew.
Mm.
So I have a pretty good sense that when I went to kindergarten, the only English I knew would have been what I would have caught from the TV because
Mm.
my parents were speaking Armenian to one another and to us. So to this day, I know Armenian pretty well. I don't speak it very well, but I understand it, particularly the Western dialect.
That's great.
Yeah.
I want to transition a bit into your own early life. Can you tell me what growing up was like for you?
Yeah. So we were, even though my dad had 10 acres, he ended up selling it in the 60s. And, but he was able to find someone, an Armenian family, that wanted to rent or lease their vineyard. And they had 40 acres of vineyard in the Fowler area, which is
Mm.
a very productive farming area for a variety of crops. And so my dad really essentially, as I was growing up, was a sharecropper of grapes that he made into
Mm.
raisins. Um, and even as a sharecropper, he was able to um, put his daughter and two sons through school, and then ultimately my younger sister some years later. I think just the economics today wouldn't allow that to happen. But he was able to do it back in the 60s.
Wow.
So that's somewhat of a testament to his ability and just the the vitality of the farming community at that time.
Mm.
Um, Ultimately, he wanted to own some of his own land, and so in 1980 he purchased some land in the Easton area, which is an unincorporated area just south of Fresno, of downtown Fresno. And we still have that. We call it the home ranch
Mm.
today, where they ultimately built a home on that property in 1990, and my parents lived there until their death. And today, my younger sister lives there.
Wow.
And my brother and I farm all through that area. And over the years, we've been able to buy pieces of properties. It's become available, different neighbors selling
Mm.
for one reason or another. And if it makes sense to us, then we've purchased that property. And so we're, you know, farming table grapes and pistachios now
Mm.
in the area.
Wow. When did you start farming?
Well, I've not known anything other than farming because my dad had the leased acreage in Fowler that he was growing grapes.
Mm.
So I grew up in it. We didn't pick the grapes. We had employees that would do that, but we did a lot of the rolling of the raisin bundles. But when they get dry, you let me back up. The raisins or the grapes are picked and they're placed onto these paper trays that are about 2 feet wide, 3 feet long. They're dried in the sun. They can be flipped over or turned by a process that people do, and then they have to be rolled into bundles, and then the contents are then dumped out into these boxes, and that's called boxing,
Mm.
and then delivered to a raisin processor. So we did a lot of the rolling ourselves. Um, my mom used to tie the entire 40-acre vineyard by herself.
Whoa.
Pretty unbelievable. As she got a little bit older, people were brought in to help, but um, Dad would be with the crew pruning, and mom would be behind tying. And that was a chore that we had to do when we were growing up and we got home from school. Change your clothes,
Mm.
go outside and help mom tie.
Wow.
Hated it.
It sounds like hard work.
It is hard work. And I think with all the hard work that we did do, we had to do a lot because, we weren't that wealthy to be able to always hire people to do it. It gave me a sense of what hard work is like and what sweat off the brow means.
Hmm. So, yeah, it sounds like you spent a lot of time on the farm and in school. I'm wondering if there were any other activities you participated in growing up?
Yeah, so we always wanted to play sports, but that wasn't something that would work out well because that would require Dad to take us to the school. We lived about a couple of miles away.
Mm.
Um, although we did play tennis, and that was in the springtime, so there wasn't as many activities during the springtime. It was really that fall and winter that we couldn't play sports because we were either doing harvest activities or we were doing pruning and tying activities. So couldn't do football, really couldn't do basketball. So tennis worked out, and as a result, I played a lot of years of tennis
That's
thereafter.
great.
Yeah. And we also got involved, my brother and I, with Future Farmers of America,
Mm.
chapters locally and all across the U.S. We had hogs that we raised
Wow.
on the school property, not at the house. And then we showed them at the county fairs. We were also involved with tree pruning and tree judging, and also vine pruning and vine judging.
Mm.
Yeah. In fact, my brother and I and another Armenian were the state champion tree pruners and the state champion tree judgers
Wow.
one particular year. So that was a nice feather in our cap.
Do you remember when that was?
That was 1978.
Wow. Did your family practice religion at all growing up?
My dad really wasn't religious, but my mom was. As we were growing up, um, every night my mom would light a candle and ask us to go into their room, get on our knees, and say a prayer. And one of the prayers was that God bless us with buying some land,
Mm.
and that actually came to fruition. Um, and praying and getting on your knees wasn't something that we enjoyed, but it's something that I think that served me well over the years for me to understand that communication with our Father in heaven is important.
Mm.
And we don't have to always have a set time. We can do it anytime. We can dial in the hotline and talk to our Lord and Savior anytime. And then we also went to the local Armenian Apostolic Church,
Okay.
St. Gregory Armenian Apostolic Church, involved with the Sunday school, and involved with holding candles on the altar.
Mm.
And yeah, that was a big part of the Armenian community and the Armenian identity. Uh, you were talking earlier about identifying as being Armenian. Part of it was the church.
Mm.
That was a collection point for other Armenians, and to see and to really compare yourself with others in the community. And they were all successful farmers.
Mm.
And we were very small sharecrop farmers. And I just knew that we had the capability to be similar to them. And all we had to do was apply ourselves, and to be able to do it.
Mm. Can you tell me more about the St. Gregory community and what that meant to you growing up?
Yeah. It was certainly a place to see other Armenian kids who was not related to better understand our relationship with our Lord and Savior, and to see the importance of culture. And there's a particular kind of vibe and feel with being with other Armenians. Um, and particularly when there's like a musical event or a gathering, um, to be able to know what it is to be Armenian.
Mm.
To hear others talk Armenian and to hear others maybe not talk Armenian, but that kind of communal sense of being united in one fashion or
Mm.
another. So yeah, that was a very big connection. The high school that we went to, every grade probably had 5 or 6 kids, if not more, that were Armenian.
Mm.
There was a sense of identity there,
Mm.
definitely, but definitely it was through the church.
Were there any special events or holidays that you experienced growing up?
Of course, there was the Armenian Remembrance Day, um, April 24th. That um, while there may not be events that we went to, we just kind of noted it and recognized what that was about. Um, Certainly, Armenian Christmas, in addition to regular Christmas. And I remember we always would go to church for Christmas Eve service,
Mm.
and there'd be only a handful of people in the church. Um, and I always remember going to that.
Wow, that's.
Yeah.
I keep hearing about the grape blessing.
Ah,
I was
yes.
wondering if you could tell me about that.
All of the Armenian churches, whether they be in Fresno or even in Fowler, would have a particular Sunday that they would do the grape blessing. And it was a remembrance or a recognition of the bounty that God has provided us.
Mm.
And so the grapes would be blessed, and then they would be handed out to the people in attendance.
Mm.
And for years and years, we were always on the receiving end because the grapes that they would have there would typically be table grapes, which is much more larger than a typical raisin grape. Um, But since we started growing table grapes, now we were then providing table grapes for some of the church's grape blessing festivals that we had. So it was nice to be on the other side to donate and to see your grapes um, being blessed and being consumed and enjoyed by people of the Armenian faith.
Wow, that's great. Did you have any favorite Armenian foods growing up?
Of course, pilaf.
Mhm.
Also loved yalanchi. Loved lamajun. I always liked lamajun with salad,
Mm.
which is why I think to this day, whenever I have a pizza, I've got to have a salad with it as well. So kind of a similar
Yeah.
combo. My mom would make it. She was a very good cook, and she would make any variety of dishes, dolma,
Mm.
of course the yalanchi, the bulgur pilaf, regular pilaf. Um, you know, um, we would barbecue any number of Armenian uh, influenced meats.
Mm.
But yeah, grew up with that. And it was always interesting when my mom would try to make something else like tacos or something else. There'd always be this Armenian influence.
Oh.
For example, on tacos, there might be some parsley on top. Or the meat that she would cook, the ground beef for the tacos, would have a little bit of an Armenian flair to them.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't quite Mexican, but it was still good.
Mm.
Still
Wow.
good.
I was curious, where did most of the Armenians live in Fresno? And could you describe what those areas were like?
Yeah. So I know that the original group of Armenians in Fresno live in an Armenian town, which is downtown Fresno. Um, what I kind of remember was there were still some that lived off of Ventura Street. But at that time, most of the Armenians were moving north.
Mm.
Um, but I can't say that there was like a specific um, area, but it was just kind of like moving north.
Were a lot of the families who lived on the farms near to you Armenian?
Yeah, in fact, where we grew up, the farmers were either Armenian, Japanese, or German.
Wow.
So where we lived across the street were Armenians. On the west side were Armenians. My godfather lived adjacent to us on the south side.
Mm.
I had cousins that lived just to the east side. So yeah, Armenians were all around us.
Wow.
So there definitely was um, a sense of others of your same kind
Mm.
being in that same area.
Wow, that's great.
I'm also amazed because I've looked into it. There are a tremendous amount of people that grew up in the Fowler area of Armenian descent.
Mm.
Like people I didn't even realize, like, oh, you grew up in Fowler? And, I guess a few years, or if you don't cross paths with them in high school, you wouldn't know it.
Mm.
But yeah, lots of Armenians in that area,
Wow.
even to this day. Whereas when we moved out here to Easton, while there was maybe a few Armenians, this area is really dominated by Portuguese families and Scandinavian families. And the Scandinavian families were the ones who started the Easton community.
Mm.
And then the Portuguese came in later. And it's kind of funny because as I drive excuse me, as I drive around, I'll point out, oh, there's our Portuguese neighbor, there's our Vietnamese neighbors. And my wife will say, whoa, 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 I don't identify people groups. And I said, well, we do that. And it's not in any kind of derogatory way. It's just identifying what group of people live there. Because if you know they're Hmong or Vietnamese, or if you know that they're Portuguese, you have a sense of kind of who they are. Or if they're Armenians, you have a sense of it. Definitely.
Wow. I was curious, were you involved in any Armenian institutions or aware of them while you were growing up?
So that's a very interesting question that I've thought a lot about over the years. Um, I think because I grew up speaking Armenian, um, because my mother spoke it all the time, I felt less of a sense to connect to being Armenian
Mm.
because I was already Armenian. I wanted to be more American.
Mm.
So I didn't join any Armenian groups or participate in activities beyond what may have been church related because I was already Armenian. I didn't need to be more Armenian or to connect with it. Whereas I did see a lot of friends do that, and I kind of always wonder, like, why are they doing that? You're already Armenian. What do you know? What do you else do you need to do or to be? Because you're already Armenian.
Mm. I want to talk more about your young adult life, I guess.
Yeah,
Could you tell me if you attended college and what that was like?
yeah. Both my brother and I went to Fresno State.
Okay.
We were both ag business majors. Um, whatever my brother did, basically I would do. For example, he was in Future Farmers America. I was in Future Farmers
Mm-hmm.
America. He played trumpet in the band, so I played trumpet in the band. He went to Fresno State. I went to Fresno State. He was an ag business major, so was I.
Mm.
Um, he decided to join a fraternity, and when I became a freshman at Fresno State, I decided to join a fraternity as well. But I only stayed in it for about 2 weeks
Mm.
because I realized at some point this isn't me, and maybe I need to do something different because I felt different inside. So I got more involved with uh, uh, more ag clubs and ag activities.
Mm.
Like there was an ag business club and others. Um, Oddly enough, I joined the Greek Society.
Oh.
And the reason why I did is because I already knew the Armenian Students Organization. I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I was with the Greek group. And that was kind of cool because there was some similarities, but lots of differences there with that group. Um, but yeah, I basically got more involved with uh, being involved in leadership groups and doing leadership activities.
Wow. Can you tell me what you did after college?
Yeah, so I graduated with an ag business degree. And I knew that our farm at the time was not large enough for me to go back to. So it really forced both my brother and myself to get jobs and to think about our career.
Mm.
And I think that ultimately has served me pretty well. I initially went to work for an organization called California Grape and Tree Fruit League, known as the California Fresh Fruit Association, and they represented growers and packers of table grapes and deciduous tree fruit, so things like peaches, plums, nectarines, but also apples and pears and other pome fruit. And so I started off as the director of membership, worked my way up to a director of government relations, and then in 1992 became their president. So I was their president for about 10 years. Then I went to work for the California Dried Fig Advisory Board, TOOS. So that was kind of a unique thing to work in an industry that there was quite a bit of Armenians. There are Armenians in fresh fruit as well, but I always think about figs and kind of old school culture in Armenia. So I worked as the manager of the dried fig and the fresh fig board for about 5 years. And then I was recruited to become the president of American Pistachio Growers.
Wow.
And I did that for the last 16 years. And American Pistachio Growers represents growers and member processors in the producing states of California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And collectively, that's all the commercial production in the United States. During my time there, we were a membership-driven organization. So we went from 350 members to over 860 members. We went from a budget about 1.2 million to $18 million.
Oh my goodness.
So large growth. And when I started there, it was just me and one other person. And when I left, there was 14 of us. So we had a fairly large staff that I was overseeing, managing.
So you do own a farm now. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so my brother over the years, my brother and I have accumulated